There's a lot of ways to start your knitting on a knitting machine, and in previous programmes we've already covered how to cast on with an open edge cast on and also how to work the E-wrap cast on. In this programme I'm going to show you how to work the latch tool cast on, which can be used as a closed edge cast on, but it can also be used as a decorative feature. On this sample I've got here, the bottom edge of this piece of knitting has been worked with the latch tool cast on, which forms a chain, a horizontal chain along the edge to give you a flat edge. It makes quite a nice feature on a piece of knitting and has been used on the edging on the dress as well. There are a couple of things you do need to bear in mind when you're doing it, but to start with I'll just demonstrate the basic technique. I brought some needles forward to do my casting on. So, as the name implies, you need your latch tool to start with. Make a slip knot in your yarn and put it onto the latch tool. And now I'm going to work the equivalent of a crochet stitch. If I just take some tension out of the yarn for a minute, around each needle. So I'm going to grab the yarn into the latch tool and pull it through the loop that's already on there. And again, I've gone around the next needle and grabbed the yarn and pull it through to make a loop around the needle. And again, get the stitch behind the latch, grab the yarn and pull it through the stitch. So for any of you who are crochet people, you can see very easily it's like working a crochet chain but around each needle. So the bottom edge will be a line of chain stitches, and I've got a loop over the top of the needle which is forming the stitch. As you're working it, you don't want to make it too tight because that will cause problems when you knit your first row. So try and keep an even tension. Pull the yarn through to give you some slack if it keeps pulling up against it, your hand. And just knit through each loop. So the yarn is going over the top of the needle and the chain is going under each needle. When we get to the last stitch, you can just hang the last loop onto the last needle and bring the yarn around to put it into the carriage. I was working that from left to right. Because I'm right-handed, I find it easier to work from left to right, but there's no reason why you can't work that particular cast on again from right to left, and in situations sometimes you do need to do that. But in this particular case, I just find it easier to work in that direction. So having brought my carriage up to my stitches, you need to take up the excess slack, check that your tension dial is correct for what you're going to knit, and knit the first row. Now if you're just using this as a method of casting on, as an open edge cast on, that's all there is to it. You would now just continue your knitting. However, you would need to remember for the first few rows that you have to push your needles forward before knitting the row in order to make sure the knitting knits off cleanly. But if I wanted to do an edging, similar to the edging that I've got on the sample here, I would have to repeat the chain stitch movement. So to do that, I need to take the yarn out of the carriage, and I need to get the carriage back onto the right-hand side now. So because I've pushed all the needles forward to holding position, I can set my carriage to partial knitting, and it won't knit those stitches, so I can take the carriage back across without dropping anything. I have to repeat this several times, so I'll show you next time how to take the carriage back before you push the needles forward. So I now repeat the process. Depending on whether you want the chain on the purl side of your knitting or the knit side of your knitting, depends on how you work the next row. For this row, I'm just going to work it assuming I want to put a chain edge along the purl side of the knitting, as this is the easier version. So I'm going to grab the yarn to make a loop around my latch tool and then bring it up inside the first 2 stitches, pull a loop through, and then I'm going to work another row of the basic latch tool cast on around every needle. I'm doing this in the same colour as the original cast on, but you can of course use a different colour if you want to make a more decorative feature. So if you're going to use a stitch pattern which uses the purl side as the right side of the knitting, for example tuck stitch or slip stitch, then you would just work this edging on the purl side of the knitting. So again, I knit 1 row. Normally you'd need to do at least 4 rows in order to keep the edge flat. So if I demonstrate this again, but this time I've taken the yarn out. I haven't brought the needles forward to holding position this time, so I need to take the carriage back to the other side without the stitches dropping. To do that on a brother machine, you need to push in the part buttons. If you've got a Knitmaster Silver Reed machine, you can use the release button, which is a little button which is situated on this side of the carriage. If you push it, it brings this section of the carriage up, so it allows you to pass across the needles without engaging them. So if I take the carriage back across the knitting, all the knitting is still there, nothing's dropped off. Before we start to knit again, you have to remember to release the buttons so that it will knit normally again. And if you've got a Knitmaster machine, you would just push the carriage back down so that it clicks back into place. So I do need to bring all the needles forward to work the crochet chain again. But this time I'm going to demonstrate what you have to do if you want the chain to be on the knit side of the fabric. The knit side being the side away from you as you're working. So this time I need to bring all the knitting forward on my needles because I have to actually work the chain stitch between the knitting and the sinker points around the needles. So again, I'm going to grab the yarn with my latch tool, get that end out of the way, and then I'm going to work the chain stitch, but this time I'm coming up between the needles as before, but I'm working between the knitting and the needle bed. So it is a lot more fiddly and a bit slower, just take your time to do it. but it does make a very nice effect on the edge of your knitting. So as you can see, I'm just coming up between the needles, grabbing the yarn and making a chain stitch around each needle again. So I've nearly got to the end of this row here. And again, so I do that one. The last stitch, again, I just put it onto the end needle, push the knitting back, bring the carriage up, put the yarn back into the carriage and knit the row. So you just keep repeating that, whether it's working it on the purl side or on the knit side, and it will give you this straight edge here. One thing you do have to remember if you're going to use this edging is that it does tend to keep the knitting wide. It tends to stretch the knitting widthways. So I would suggest you do a sample before you put it onto a garment to see whether you need to adjust the number of stitches you're using, because you don't want your bottom edge to flare out. But once you've worked out how to make it so that it will give you a nice straight edge, it makes a very neat and slightly more unusual edging to some of your garments. That's all for now. See you soon.